In 1940, Germany unleashed a blitzkrieg on an unprepared and unsuspecting Europe. Hitler's tank divisions shocked the world with their overwhelming mobility, armor and firepower as they carved up the continent for the Axis forces. The Allies knew they would have to work against time to develop and produce a tank that would defeat the Third Reich. In 1942, Britain unveiled its new weapon of war, a machine it hoped would save lives and halt the spread of fascist terror, the Churchill tank. By 1916, the First World War was entering its second, terrible, blood-soaked year. Since 1914, the French had endured the heaviest fighting with the Germans at the battles of the Marne and Verdun. The French armies were completely exhausted. For the British, it was time to step up a gear and take on the burden of crushing the German army once and for all. By the 17th of September 1916, the British prepared to unleash a secret weapon that would not only crush the Germans, but staunch the flood of death that was desecrating the ranks of its army. The age of the tank had begun.
The British invented the tank, and by 1917 they were very good at its use. Now initially, when it first comes in 1916, it's very primitive, there aren't enough of them, it's mechanically unreliable, but it's a start, and like all new weapon systems, it takes time for it to come to be really of much use. But by 1917 it was very good. By 1918, only the British have got a workable battle tank as opposed to an upgunned armoured car. And it is the British who have integrated the tank into an all-arms force with the infantry, the artillery, the engineers, and increasingly the air, combining to produce aggression on the battlefield.
Tens of thousands, nobody quite knows how many, infantry soldiers owed their lives to the presence of tanks. The tank completely broke the German army's will to fight. After very small, modest beginnings on the Somme, through to Amiens, where we had over 400 tanks in the line, and we punched an 8-mile hole through the German defences. This attack was described by Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German army. There was no chance that they would win now. They were only facing defeat. And ultimately, Winston Churchill described the tank crews as being the most profit-bearing group of the entire army.
The tank enjoyed a wave of popularity that swept through Britain after its first tour on the battlefields of France. But not everyone in the army shared Churchill's enthusiasm for the tank. Many cavalry commanders thought the tank was nothing more than a very expensive fad.
After the First World War, there were some officers in the British Army who believed that the tank had been almost a freak product of the Western Front during the First World War, and that nothing like that would ever be needed again.
The tank wasn't a war-winning weapon, despite what the newspapers and the PR merchants said. By the end of the war, it's a very useful adjunct to the assets we already have. Not a war-winning weapon, but a very useful bit of kit.
The British did better than other countries in the sense that they preserved their tank corps after the First World War ended. They developed it, they gave it quite a high status in the army.
There was great debate as to what a tank was for. What was the role of the tank? Was it just something to provide intimate fire support for the infantry? If it was, it didn't have to move very fast. 4 miles an hour would be quite good enough because that was as fast as the infantry could move. Was it something that ought to be able to operate independently? The land cruiser, in which case it had to be able to operate rather faster, it had to be able to cross obstacles, it had to have reasonable firepower. Was it just a defensive weapon? Was it an attacking weapon? Or was it just for reconnaissance? And all these debates as to exactly what the tank was for, combined with lack of funding, all really led, I think, to the British going down a bit of a blind alley between the wars.
In 1934, one of the last mechanised exercises ran by the Army was basically, to put it bluntly, fixed by senior officers to make it look as though the infantry and the horse cavalry were still predominant on the battlefield, and from that point onwards, mobile mechanised armoured warfare took a back seat in British military thinking.
The area in which you can say we excelled was in fact in the theoretical use of tanks. The sad thing is that these thoughts were adopted enthusiastically by the German army once Hitler came to power, and I'm afraid we paid sorely for the results of years of political neglect.
I'm not sure that the British had a great deal of knowledge about what the Germans were doing, and I'm not sure the British were terribly interested, although they ought to have been. The Germans knew exactly what we were up to. They frequently visited England, official, formal, properly constituted visits. They came over, they looked at this armoured division, they looked at how it works, they talked to the British who were using it, they learnt a lot from it, they took those lessons back and they applied them to their own development of armoured doctrine.
The tanks produced before the outbreak of the Second World War were a painful reminder of how economic cutbacks had eaten into Britain's defence budget. In 1935, the manufacturer Vickers worked with the government to thrash out a specification for an infantry tank. Vickers argued that it could build a tank for £15,000 or less. This figure was later slashed to a mere £6,000. But would the resulting cut-price tank live up to expectations?
There was nothing. There was a track, there was an engine, there was an armoured hull, and there was an armoured turret mounting a machine gun, and that was it. It looked like a duck, and it got its name from a cartoon duck of the period called Matilda.
What was really wanted was a main battle tank that could do everything, but at the beginning of the war, and for quite some time, that isn't the British concept. So we have a whole series of infantry tanks, and the Matilda really is the one that we start the war with.
The A-11, otherwise known as the Matilda infantry support tank, had a two-man crew. Mounting a .3-inch machine gun, it had armour plating up to 60 millimetres thick. It was 4.85 metres long, 2.28 metres wide, and 1.86 metres high, weighing in at 11,161 kilos.
The Matilda I was a very simple little stopgap vehicle with a two-man crew. It did have some stout armour. It was reasonably reliable. The problem was that it was such a small machine, all it could mount was a machine gun, which was very, very difficult to handle indeed.
It had all the problems of extreme cheapness. It didn't have any kind of real armour-piercing weapon for use against enemy tanks.
The interesting thing about the British is that they were the ones who concentrated upon armour. And that was indeed its principal item of note. The rest of it was extremely mediocre. It was only designed to go at walking pace. It had a Ford car engine, very underpowered, very slow motion suspension, and a very light armament. It was literally a small mobile pillbox.
It has hardly got any punch at all. It is used quite a lot on the counter-attack at Arras in 1940, when in fairness it does put the wind up the Germans. Rommel almost gets killed by one of them. In fact, his ADC is killed. Rommel thinks he's being attacked by 5 brigades. In fact, he's being attacked by 3 regiments.
This counter-attack not only mauled Rommel's division, but scared off the neighbouring SS division. The Matilda caused such alarm in German headquarters that the Panzer Division's drive to the coast was delayed for 24 hours. Crucially, This delay helped to ensure the success of the Dunkirk evacuation.
But really, that was the finest hour of the Matilda. It was never really very much good. It never really carried any punch.
Matilda II was an enormous advance on Matilda I. It had a proper turret with a 2-pound gun in it. Again, even thicker armour. It was relatively mobile at around 12 miles an hour. It was a little faster than walking pace, and it had a reasonable radius of action. The problem with it was that it was much more expensive to produce.
What it couldn't do was fire a high explosive round. So from that perspective, it was actually probably worse at supporting the infantry than the Matilda I, because all it could do was attack enemy tanks or defend the infantry from marauding enemy tanks. It couldn't provide direct high explosive support to support infantry in the attack, which is what the infantry tanks were supposed to be there for.
There weren't a great many of them, just one regiment of Matildas in 1940, when Wavell started his offensive against the Italians. The Italians found they hadn't a gun which was capable of penetrating the Matilda at all. In fact, the appearance of a Matilda was often sufficient for their infantry to throw their hands up and say, well, enough's enough. In fact, the Matilda really sealed the fate of the Italian 10th Army, with Sidi Barrani and later at Bardia and then Tobruk. They had nothing which could stand against it.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Their own tanks were very, very badly designed, and their anti-tank guns were quite inadequate.
During this campaign, the tank earned itself the title Queen of the Battlefield, a title it retained until the Africa Corps, with its devastating anti-tank guns, reached North Africa the following year.
It enjoyed enormous success in France and in the early desert campaigns, where it was impervious to most standard issue Axis anti-tank guns. The only thing that could destroy it was an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. But it proved to be immensely successful and was very, very popular with the troops.
The Valentine infantry support tank was certainly a step up from its predecessors. It needed a 3-man crew. It mounted a 2-pounder gun, as well as a Beza 7.92mm machine gun. Its armour was up to 65mm thick. It was powered by an AEC engine that was capable of a 90-mile range, 135 brake horsepower, and a road speed of 15 miles per hour.
The War Office initially wasn't very keen on it because it didn't fit into the cruiser tank role very well. It wasn't fast enough for that, they believed. On the other hand, it didn't really fit the infantry tank role either because it wasn't as heavily armoured as they thought infantry tanks really needed to be. So it was a bit of a misfit. But they needed tanks urgently, desperately, in the early stages of the Second World War, and so it was decided to go ahead and produce this vehicle. And it's a good job that they did go ahead with it, because indeed it was one of the better British tanks of the early part of the Second World War.
It got its name because the designs were submitted on St. Valentine's Day, and it used components which had been tried and tested, like the slow-motion suspension on the A9 and 10 cruisers. Also, very good heavy-duty engines. It hardly ever broke down.
The Valentine, at last we've actually got a British tank which is mechanically reliable. But at the same time, it's still an infantry tank, so it's terribly slow. And initially, it was a terribly expensive way to carry a machine gun. As the war goes on, however, it is upgunned with difficulty, because one of the problems with the Valentine was it had a very small turret. But things do get better, and we actually produce an awful lot of them. About a third of British tank production throughout the war is Valentines.
It was most unusual in a desert environment to find a tank with that record of reliability. One regiment, in fact, travelled all the way from Alamein to Tunisia with the same vehicles, which is almost unique and got the nickname Monty's Foxhounds because of it. Disadvantages were that it was a rather small tank, a two-man turret, and really it's a three-man job inside a turret. Other than that, it was a nice little vehicle. You could tuck it into a piece of ground and hardly anybody would know you were there.
Meanwhile, back in the United Kingdom, the 4th Infantry Tank had taken shape. When war broke out in 1939, it was agreed that although trench warfare was a thing of the past, there would be a need for an infantry tank capable of crossing shell-torn ground and other obstacles.
If the Churchill had been produced 25 years earlier, it would have been brilliant, because it was designed for the First World War. It was designed for the Western Front, and people thought the Western Front in the Second War would be, as it was in the First War, a battlefield littered with shell holes, great deep lines of trenches, thick belts of wire, speed not terribly important, but a tank had to have the ability to cross obstacles. Well, unfortunately, of course, for the designers of the Churchill, the Second War wasn't anything like that. The Second War was much more a war of manoeuvre, so many of the qualities that the Churchill was intended to have were actually irrelevant.
At that particular time, we had virtually no tanks left in the country. It was important, critically important, to get as many tanks into production as we possibly could. And Vauxhall were told to get it in production and issued to units within a year. Now, they did hit their target, but that left insufficient time for testing and evaluation.
Churchill was an attempt to rectify the mistakes of the past. It had a 5-man crew and mounted 3 guns, a 2-pounder, a Beza 7.92mm machine gun, as well as a 3-inch howitzer. The Churchill's armour was up to 102mm thick. Its Bedford 12-cylinder engine was capable of a 90-mile range, 350 brake horsepower, and a top road speed of 15.5 miles per hour.
In 1940, we desperately needed a tank. Most of the ones we had been left behind at Dunkirk. So the Churchill was rushed into production without being properly tried and tested first, and therefore inevitably there were big mechanical problems to begin with. And it was said that Mr. Churchill was very unhappy about his name being given to something that didn't work terribly well.
The Churchill itself, the original specification was very much of the First World War lozenge-shaped Mark I to Mark V tanks with a very large track surface area, which is why if you look at a photograph of a Churchill, it looks quite old-fashioned, and it looks a bit like a First World War tank, especially with its large track area.
When crews actually started training on the Churchill, they found they were confronted with a complete minefield of technical problems. There were engine problems, there were transmission problems, there were track problems. There was even a problem in wet weather because in their haste the manufacturers had not included internal drainage channels, so you would find water slopping round your feet. But Vauxhall had attached engineering teams to the regiments which were equipped with the Churchill, and they resolved these issues very quickly with a series of modifications. In fact, the handbook says that we know the vehicle isn't perfect, and then lists a whole string of faults. And these were put right very, very quickly, so that by the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, you had a workable tank.
The crews liked the Churchill. It was much less likely to go on fire when it was hit than, for example, the Sherman. One of the main faults of the Sherman was that it brewed up if it was hit. You could escape from a Churchill very much more easily than you could from any other tank because it had two hatches on the side. And it was relatively easy to look after. There was quite a lot of room inside a Churchill. It was comfortable.
The Churchill tank visually looked unusual in that the track and the sprockets that the track ran around stuck out from the front of the tank, which made it look like it had got horns on the front, and that's the term that it was colloquially known by. And in many designers' views, that was not really acceptable because it would restrict the vision of the driver, who was set back more into the front of the hull. However, as it was found, tanks generally were so noisy and the vision was so restricted that little loss of extra vision didn't really make much difference on the battlefield. So overall, it didn't turn out to be too bad.
Inside the tank, if you looked forward into the driving compartment, you'd see the driving position on the right with the usual controls, but instead of two steering levers with which most tanks are equipped, you'd find a tiller bar. Otherwise, the hull gunner lives on the left of the vehicle. You can see his mounting a Besa machine gun in a ball and his gun sight there. Inside the turret itself, looking forward to the left, you're looking from the commander's position, and you will see the gunner's seat immediately in front of him with its gun controls. You'd also notice, looking at the Churchill, that it seemed an awful lot of hull for a very small turret.
Before the advent of motorways and things like that, most large-scale tank movements had to take place by rail. And because of this, it was felt that a two-man turret would be the best way forward. So you'd only have the tank commander and the gunner in there, and it meant that the tank commander not only was directing where the driver should go, he was directing where, if he could see, where the enemy were to the gunner, who had to lay the gun and fire at the target. And he also had to operate all the radio equipment so he could stay in touch with all the other tanks in his unit. And if he was a commander, he had to talk to a higher command as well. And it was found to be completely impractical in actual battlefield use. The commander just became so overloaded with work tasks that it was either a choice of staying in communication with the other tanks in the unit or firing at the enemy. Pretty early on in the war, it was identified that a three-man turret at a very minimum was needed, and a lot of modification and design work went into upgrading the early model tanks to fit new turrets to them later in the war.
The Churchill entered the war at Dieppe in France on the 19th of August 1942. A raid was mounted to test the defences of a heavily fortified stretch of enemy coastline. The tragic lessons learned would later be applied when the Allies returned to continental Europe.
It's often thought that the Churchill was a great failure at Dieppe, and we're all told that. Yes, Churchill tanks were landed on the beach, but any tank landed on the beach would have had a problem in Dieppe. The problem was that the beach was shingle.
The Canadians played the principal part in this, and it was one of their Churchill regiments, the Calgary Regiment, which came ashore from the landing craft. Now, the going was bad. In many cases, the steel tracks simply couldn't get a grip of the shingle. Little tiny smooth pebbles that skidded about all over the place. The more the tracks turned, the deeper the tanks got.
There was then a sea wall. So what the tank had to do was drive up the beach, get over the sea wall. Now there was a plan to allow tanks to do that. Engineers were going to land, construct wooden ramps, and the tanks would drive up the ramp and into the town. The engineers either got lost or the boats got sunk. They didn't arrive on the beach, or if they did, they didn't arrive with their ramps, and the tanks simply couldn't get off the beach. But that would have applied to any tank of the period. Nobody would have been able to get off the beach, so it wasn't something that was just peculiar to the Churchill.
Really, it was the operation that was compromised. The Churchill's performance, it probably did no better than, or no worse than could have been expected. So, really, as a black mark against the tank, Dieppe doesn't really stand up as a true test of the tank's capabilities.
We couldn't embark any or re-embark any of the tanks. So they all fell into enemy hands. When the Germans came down to examine the Churchill, the layout they thought belonged to another war. They even thought that these were obsolete or discarded designs that we had chosen to waste. They couldn't see how the Churchill could fit into their own pattern of armoured warfare, and it didn't. And they said to themselves, there's no point in our trying to develop a tank arm of our own, because clearly it's a mechanical novelty and of no use.
After the costly failure at Dieppe, the Churchill's career seemed over before it had even begun. Instead of replacing the Churchills in service, it was decided to send a number to the North African desert. It was here that the Churchill was forced to rise to the challenge or face the scrap heap.
The Churchill first saw action in North Africa. Where it really came into its own was not on the plains of Libya, but once we got into Tunisia.
Yes, a limited number of Churchills were used in the desert, primarily in an evaluation unit known as King Force. Its first operation was Alamein, in which they did surprisingly well. It was very important for the Churchill at this stage because the whole project was threatened with cancellation.
The Churchill is incredibly useful, to everybody's surprise, because really it was almost obsolete. And then suddenly we find, here's a tank that can go up terrifically steep slopes. Very useful in Tunisia.
I have come across instances where a squadron commander has actually led his tanks up a slope which nobody thought anybody could climb, and actually got there. He's led them on foot, you know, and it's quite hair-raising. Of course, it doesn't always come off. Sometimes on the slope a tank will crab, go sideways, and once it starts, then there's no stopping it. I have one horrific incident I know where Churchill crabbed on a very steep hillside, turned over 6 times before coming to the bottom, threw its turret off, and of course none of the crew survived. But this was the sort of risk that the Churchill crews took because they had a lot of confidence in their vehicle, and they knew that 9 times out of 10 it wouldn't let them down.
They were all very, very heavily hit by anti-tank weapons of all calibers and types of artillery, and they survived remarkably well. So on the whole, its initial combat experience in the Western Desert was highly encouraging.
It played a very, very significant part in that the Axis defences were located surrounding the Matilda Valley, which was the gateway for Tunis. The very fact that the Churchill could climb these hills and deal with the enemy on them made it extremely significant. Once the first major hill had been taken, the writing was on the wall, and in fact you could measure the time in which it was going to take before the next hill and the one after that, and in fact you could almost predict the date that the Axis surrender would take place. So yes, the Churchill, if you like, was the key in the lock that opened the door, and after that it was a simple case of mopping up.
Despite the Churchill's gravity-defying ability to climb hills, the old problem of cooperation between the infantry and the tank corps remained. As Neville Gilman, a former member of the 7th Armoured Division, remembers, there was little understanding between infantry and tank crews.
We were shelled, but when you're in a tank, I mean, this was artillery, not anti-tank shells. So, although it was a bit noisy, a bit uncomfortable, we weren't really bothered. But we felt very sorry for the infantry who were around us, so they were being shelled. But it is very strange how the infantry chaps always used to say to us, "Oh my God, I wouldn't be in those tin cans for all the tea in China, you know." And we used to say, "Oh, well, poor chaps down there, you know, we're relatively safe."
The British took an awful long time to get infantry-tank cooperation working. The tanks didn't really trust the infantry didn't really trust the tanks. They didn't do enough training together. They never really got their act together until actually quite late on in the war. There were other reasons for this as well, one being communications. It was very difficult for an infantryman to actually talk to a tank commander. Not all the radios were compatible and the like. When handheld anti-tank weapons come in, it's a real worry for the tanks.
The technological development that made it possible was the shaped high explosive charge, which essentially sent a jet of flame burning through the armour of a tank, causing chaos and havoc, as you can imagine, within.
An infantryman carrying a Panzerfaust or a Panzerschreck could hide himself pretty much anywhere. And as long as the infantryman was brave enough to stay under cover while the tank got close enough for the range to be effective, these handheld weapons proved quite devastating.
I found a good position in the rut of where the farm carts had gone in and out of a gate, and the ruts were so nice and deep, so I was able to get in the rut. I fired 5 projectiles at the Tiger tank. It was a huge thing, and I was looking straight down the barrel of it, and as I fired the last one, he fired, and it landed on my left, and so I was hit in my all down the left side, from the head down to my shoulder.
There had to be a rethink on infantry tank tactics. So what happened basically from this point onwards was that in open country the tanks would lead the attack as usual. In close country, sort of vineyards, bushes, you know, heavily bushed country, forests, built-up areas, the infantry had to lead, with the tanks following quite closely behind in support.
As the war dragged on and as casualties mounted, it became painfully clear that specialist vehicles were needed to help combat engineers in their dangerous work. This need prompted the arrival of the Churchill Avery.
Once the lessons of the Dieppe raid had been evaluated, we knew the sort of obstacles we had to overcome to break through the coastal defences of what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall. The Churchill hull was very, very suitable for conversion to a variety of engineering tasks because of its size.
Combat engineering is an enormously lethal endeavour, attempting to remove obstacles, bridge obstacles, demolish things, clear minefields under enemy fire. As you can imagine, doing that type of activity, incredibly heavy casualties, and some method had to be found of getting around this. The Churchill proved to be an ideal platform. It's good cross-country capability and heavy armour, and quite low profile, which meant that additional equipment wouldn't raise its profile too much.
So the Royal Engineers developed a special turret for it, and it mounted a 290mm mortar which fired a bomb called the Flying Dustbin. And the Flying Dustbin, when it hit a concrete blockhouse or bunker, would simply crack the concrete open. There are other devices that could be used on the Avery, as it was called. It's a a box girder bridge which you could lay against a sea wall.
There were fascines, which are huge bundles, nowadays of pipes, but in the First World War and the Second World War, they were huge bundles, almost of firewood. These you had to be very, very careful. They're enormously heavy, so they needed a tank with very strong suspension to carry them. And you dropped them into any kind of obstacle ditch, and you could drive over them. Slight problem with the Churchill when they first started using it was the fact that they put them on the rear of the vehicle and tried to launch them over the back. The problem was the exhaust used to set them on fire, which was quite alarming for the crews. So they were in fact generally carried on the front of the vehicle, although that did foul the main armament.
We were glad of the Churchills because they cleared the minefields with their flails, so we were rather grateful when they came.
What they did was cut down on this terrible human wastage, and they proved enormously successful in Normandy.
One of the most devastating and intimidating Churchill variants was the Churchill Crocodile flamethrower. It reached Normandy after D-Day.
The Crocodile was one of these other derivatives, usually a derivative of a Churchill, sometimes a Cromwell, usually a Churchill, which was in fact a mobile flamethrower. It towed behind it a great big tank of petroleum jelly, and it had a projector on the front, and it fired flame.
The flame gun would blast a jet of flame, well over 100 yards. It stuck to everything it touched. It's a terrible weapon. Quite often, it would work in conjunction with the Avry. So you would find that the Avry would fire its bomb and crack open a blockhouse, and if the occupants didn't come out immediately, a Crocodile would approach within range and flame it. And the result was the flame fuel would drop down the tracks into the interior, and that usually got them out.
Very useful for clearing out bunkers or trench systems. Pretty nasty way to kill people, and in general, if your Crocodile broke down, you legged it, because both sides, totally illegally and quite unofficially, shot people with flamethrowers.
Often the mere appearance of a crocodile was enough for people to put their hands up. Conversely, if a crocodile crew was captured, they could frequently find no mercy being shown to them. I won't say they liked their work. It's been expressed to me by former crocodile crewmen that they considered it inhuman. You can well imagine the result, what it looks like, and once seen, never forgotten. And it really was very unpleasant. But war is unpleasant, and it got results. That's what you're after.
They were a particularly horrific weapon, and certainly Churchill Crocodile crews could expect very short shrift from Germans if they were captured. However, it has to be said that in many occasions, merely the presence of a flamethrower tank was enough to force Germans who might otherwise have held out to surrender immediately. So perhaps it was not quite such an inhumane weapon as might be imagined.
On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies mounted an amphibious invasion of the beaches of Normandy. Their plan was to draw most of the German armour onto the British and Canadian sectors to enable the Americans to break out of the beachhead. To achieve this, Churchill regiments supported a number of heavy infantry raids on enemy-held villages. But the Germans had planned on a bitter fight. Forbidden by Hitler to surrender any ground, the Germans launched furious counterattacks with Tigers, Panthers and Panzer Grenadiers. Allied soldiers were acutely aware of their appalling disadvantage. Not only were they expected to fight in terrain their tanks could barely cope with, but they had to flush out a well-entrenched enemy who had stronger tanks and anti-tank weapons. The situation was bleak.
On level ground, the Churchill couldn't take on the Mark IV, never mind the Mark V Panther or the Mark VI Tiger. It simply wasn't in their league. So you didn't put them up against the Mark IV, the Panther or the Tiger if you could possibly avoid it. You used the Churchill either as its derivatives that we've talked about, flame-throwing tanks and the like, or you used them in hilly areas where they came into their own, but you didn't put them up against Tigers.
The main reason why the Churchill continued in frontline service throughout the war was because of its very thick frontal armour, its survivability on the battlefield. It was the only real Allied tank, including the American tanks, that could even think about standing up to a Panther or a Tiger in a straight-on fight. It probably couldn't knock out the Panther or the Tiger, but it could at least attempt to hold the ground that it had taken while waiting for other supporting elements to come up and help it.
In straight tank versus tank fighting, the Churchill had much thicker armour than anything else the Allies had, but it was still capable of being penetrated at fighting ranges by German 88mm and 75mm rounds. And there was a very famous instance when a section of Churchill's was knocked out in the space of 2 or 3 minutes by 3 or 4 German Jagdpanther tanks armed with 88mm guns. But in many respects it had better survivability than a lot of other Allied tanks. But it still suffered from the basic problem. It had the 75mm gun at best, which was you could use against an average German tank at quite close ranges. But getting there was difficult. And in fact, in many respects, the Churchill was a disadvantage here because it didn't have quite that high dash speed that tanks like the Cromwell and perhaps the Sherman had.
All the German tanks, even the Panthers, were very quiet. You didn't hear it until somebody said, "Oh, there's one coming round the corner," you know. They were that quiet, whereas our own Churchills and Shermans kicked up such a hell of a row you could hear them a mile away.
Generally speaking, it was difficult for a Churchill or any number of Churchills to oppose a set of emplaced Tigers. And quite often, I'm thinking of some instances in Italy where medium artillery was the only way you could get them to shift at all.
Even when the 6-pounder gun was fitted as it was to some Churchills later on, the armour penetration of that against late German tanks of World War II, such as the Tiger and the Panther, its armour-piercing capability really just wasn't good enough.
They're always fighting at a disadvantage, and the crews was, really very fed up about that. They wished they could hit back on equal terms. In an attempt to put the Churchill on something like a parity with the Panther or the larger, more big up-done Mark IVs, it was decided to build a super Churchill.
The wonderfully named Black Prince was an upgun Churchill. What they did was they took a Churchill, they re-engineered the turret, and they put a 17-pounder gun in it. Now, a 17-pounder gun was a good anti-tank gun.
Now, in order to do this, the hull had to be widened. An enormous number of other things had to be done to the tank. A number of prototypes were built, but unfortunately Black Prince wasn't in production early enough for the Second World War. In fact, the infantry tank concept really died with it.
Unfortunately, of course, it arrives too late to have much effect on the war. But they are used in the Korean War, where their ability to go up hills, plus the excellent gun, were more than a match for anything the Chinese or the North Koreans could produce.
Although the Black Prince arrived after the surrender of the Axis forces, the Churchill had one more war to fight. In November 1951, a Crocodile squadron landed in Korea. It formed part of the British 29th Infantry Brigade Group.
At that stage, the war was moving quite rapidly from north to south and back again. The idea of flaming fixed fortifications no longer applied in those particular circumstances. So the squadron, except for with one exception, dropped its trailers and fought as conventional Churchill gun tanks, and they helped to break through to a trapped infantry battalion, got most of its companies out. And they also worked with the Americans, who were quite generous in their praise. It worked beautifully on the Korean hills, except in winter, where you'll find the steel tracks just wouldn't grip. It's semi-frozen tundra.
From its debut in the blood-soaked fields of the Great War to the barren slopes of North Korea, the infantry support tank has played a crucial role in wars that have altered the world map. After decades of cost-cutting, indecision, and a series of disappointing tanks, the hopes of Britain and its army rested on the Churchill. Despite its shaky start on the beaches of Dieppe, its legendary hill-climbing ability not only saved it from the scrap heap, but helped kick the Axis out of North Africa. The Churchill was the pioneer of the battlefield and deserves its place as one of the finest tanks Britain has ever produced.
The Churchill, although slow and appearing old-fashioned, was a tough battlefield survivor, and for that reason, the reason that it could take so much punishment on the battlefield, it deserved its place as probably the best British design tank of the war.
The Churchill, in a sentence, was immensely strong, had tremendous cross-country capability, but was really a lot of tank for very little gun.
The Churchill was designed and intended for a war that never happened. It had all sorts of things wrong with it to begin with, but its ability to climb hills was the thing that gave it a lease of life, and it's also its ability to be converted to other purposes that kept it in life long after really it should have been.